good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. Recently at a presentation in Harvard, I heard a leading researcher in his field predict that within 5 years, he would be able to regrow damaged human knees, and that within 10 or 15 years, he would succeed in human limb regeneration. Yesterday, we heard Rick Klausner talk of the very bright prospects of stem cell use for cancer cures. It's very difficult to listen to such speeches without being swept away by the promise that biotech has in store for humanity. But is it really so? One of the challenges of our times is inequality. Inequality both within and between countries. Inequality is not only a moral challenge, it also undermines peace. Inequality creates exclusion, and as a recent World Bank UN study entitled Pathways for Peace has shown, exclusion is perhaps the major contributor to social unrest, violence and crime, conflict and terrorism. Reversing the trend to greater inequality, beyond being the right thing to do, is necessary. Today we live in an era where there's more conflict than at any time since the end of the Cold War, and inequality is intimately related to that rise in conflict. Is biotech going to help overcome this challenge, or will it accentuate social differences and tensions? These are the questions I want to explore in my remarks today and suggest that there is a framework that may help us in the way forward. Not so far from here, the problems many are facing are acute. By the time I finish this 15-20-minute speech, 20 children within a day's travel distance will have died of totally avoidable malnutrition, died of hunger. Hunger globally is on the rise. In Britain, 1 in every 4 children suffer from overweight or obesity, while globally, about 1 in 4 children are experiencing stunted growth. Stunting causes chronic, long-term, enduring harm to physical health and cognitive capacities. There are solutions, and many of you here in the room can help find them. But more broadly, how do we ensure that what we do in science and technology serves the greater good? We have a set of criteria, a framework that can be helpful. In times of enormous national and international divisions, the world came together in September 2015 to agree on the common goals to creating sustainable, prosperous societies, the so-called Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, also referred to as the 2030 Agenda. This agenda has 17 interlinked goals, including Goal 1, eradicating poverty, and Goal 2, eradicating hunger, Goal 3, ensuring good health and well-being, Goal 4, access to quality education, and Goal 5, gender equality, Goal 8, decent work, Goal 11, sustainable cities, and more. The 17 goals are broken up in 169 targets. They are intended to guide national and international development work. This agenda can also serve to measure the work done in research and development. It provides a framework for evaluating whether science is contributing to the global development agenda. Thanks in large part to the application of past scientific effort, the world has made progress. We can congratulate ourselves that things in many ways have never been better. In proportional terms, poverty rates are at the lowest they've ever been. Human beings are living longer than ever. Globally, child mortality rate has decreased by 56% since 1990. That means about 20,000 fewer children died every day in 2016 than in 1990. There are many other encouraging statistics. But these averages can be misleading. These statistics don't mean much the children of the Central African Republic, where, as Felix indicated, I served before taking up my current post in New York. In the Central African Republic, there is one doctor per 25,000 citizens, in contrast to one per 350 in the UK, not to mention the chronic lack of medicine or equipment. The vast majority of Central Africans will go through life, a short life, on average some 30 years shorter than that of a UK citizen, without ever having seen a doctor. They, and millions like them across the planet, are being left behind by galloping human progress elsewhere. The fact that all world leaders came together to agree on a global development agenda holds great promise, but the gaps to achieving the objectives agreed upon are very significant and were late on every front. Rises in inequality are one painful indicator of this. To achieve the SDGs, there's a need for a leap in progress, which will only be possible with a change in script and innovative approaches. As Dr. May said on the last panel, we have to kickstart a new trajectory. We must leverage every digital discovery, scientific finding, and technological advance available to us. Biotechnology has an immense potential to be a leading discipline in this effort, and it provides us a tremendous opportunity to significantly accelerate the pace. As you know, and as the last speakers highlighted, biotechnology has the potential to reduce global hunger and strengthen global food security by making improvements that span the agricultural value chain from farm to fork. It could have a significant impact on the areas of planting, pest control, harvesting, post-harvest storage, and transport. The UN is applying some of these advances already. The United Nations World Food Programme is engaged in the mechanical fortification of foods to improve the nutritional value of staple crops for vulnerable populations. But we know more can be done by leveraging biotechnologies. Beyond agriculture and food systems, medical biotechnology has the potential to improve the health and well-being of the most vulnerable. To give just one important example, biotechnologies could create accurate, rapid, and affordable diagnostic devices that can be deployed where there are limited medical services. They would transform access to treatment that patients would get in places like the Central African Republic without a need for a large number of doctors and expensive medical infrastructure. These developments would have a cascading effect on other sustainable development goals, such as access to education and increased gender equality. Developing new methods of fortifying foods with critical vitamins and minerals will improve the physical and mental development of women and children, for example, and would improve their ability to take part in the economy. This in turn would decrease economic inequalities. The promise of technology is real, but there are risks in this approach too, which we cannot ignore. Technology has always been a double-edged sword. It can bring about major improvements to quality of life, but it also presents serious ethical questions and a considerable risk of unintended consequences. As I indicated, one unintended consequence of biotech could be that instead of reducing inequality, it could exacerbate it. We have a natural tendency to focus our research and development on high-end technology and understandably be profit-oriented. The scholar Yuval Noah Harari wrote in The Guardian that with rapid improvements in biotechnology and bioengineering, we may reach a point where it becomes possible to translate economic inequality into biological inequality, and that as a result, humankind might consequently split into biological castes. I would argue that biological inequality already exists. While in some parts of the globe, genome research helps identify the perfect sperm donor for the healthiest, most intelligent human beings, elsewhere, hundreds of millions of people are already left behind biologically due to malnutrition. Stunting in childhood, as mentioned, has lifelong consequences for physical health and cognitive abilities. Biotechnology can be the solution to this problem, or it can escalate it. Beyond deepening inequality, biotech could harbor other unintended consequences, which I'm sure you're well aware of. There's no need to explain to you the concerns that rise, for example, from the prospect of re-engineering human pathogens and their potential release. This duality of technological advancement applies to most, if not all, of what we colloquially call frontier issues. Vast potential accompanied with high levels of risk exist in the development of new manufacturing techniques, in automation, in cyberspace, artificial intelligence, etc. As Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, recently said, the dark side of innovation is a threat we must confront, and it has moved from the frontier to the front door. The challenge, thus, is ensuring that the scientific revolution we're living through is, as best possible, guided towards promoting peaceful coexistence, constructive social progress, and standards of living in greater freedom. It cannot just be guided by business interests. To ensure that it serves the many and not just the few, and that it serves those who need it most and not at their expense, it has to have a global perspective and to prioritize the promotion of global goods. The Sustainable Development Goals are a helpful framework in this respect. In the broadest sense, our challenge is to maximize the benefits of the technological revolution while mitigating and preventing the dangers. We need to work closely together to ensure this takes place. Pioneers like yourselves and the United Nations can cooperate in the pursuit of these shared interests. We should work together to develop technologies that address the modest dreams of the world's most marginalized. This means furthering equitable access to technology, which is one of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. The UN has always played a pivotal role building global consensus around norms and standards where needed, or where existing frameworks were inadequate. Some important work in this regard is already being done at UNESCO's Biotechnology program. We cannot make progress on these discussions without you, who are at the forefront of innovation. Your involvement is fundamental to share good practices, to explain if and where norms or standards are needed, and to help shape principles and agreements so that technology is a force for good. You, I would argue, need us too, to share with you our experience of working on the most daunting questions of our time, to help you define the needs and envisage the responses. Together, we can make great strides towards closing the most threatening gap of our times, the gap of inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio, for a very inspiring speech. And you now have the opportunity to ask Fabrizio about some of the work the United Nations does, and there's a dialogue now. So do you have any questions?
Hello, good morning, Fabrizio. Thanks for this incredible and inspirational presentation. Well, I'm Manuel Besares. I'm from Mexico. I'm a genomic biotechnologist doing an MPH in international health. So this is quite something that we try to link in our common daily basis. So my question is about how will first, this is about for developing countries, low and middle income countries, because our perspective that many times is a gap that we don't address in a global scale. So how we could increase the development of biotechnology in low and middle income countries with a local perspective of both real and perceived needs.
Now, I think a lot of it is about building national capacities. I think in one of on the former panel, that point was also made. Let me give you a concrete example. In the Central African Republic, where I spoke about the very low proportion of doctors, for about 20 or 30 years now, since independence, you have every year hundreds of international doctors go there, many from Médecins Sans Frontières and from other international aid organizations, also from the UN, the WHO. They come in with their training skills, they stay a short time, and they leave. It costs a lot. It costs, even when they're volunteers, an awful lot to deploy international medical staff. You have to build up an infrastructure around them, a security system. You have to take them on home leave. It's a very costly operation. I've argued that if a fraction of that annual cost had been put into building up a viable national health system, over 20, 30 years, we would have today in Central African Republic a national capacity which now is simply lacking. And we're just perpetuating a dependence on international systems. So I think much greater investment, even when it can look very difficult, into national capacities is sorely needed. And then, of course, something that is politically very delicate, the whole issue of sharing advanced technology and exchanging research. But there are some countries that are more well inclined towards that than others.
I'm Daniel. I'm a PhD student here at the University LMB. And I was just curious how these are all very long-term goals. And we're probably living in one of the most volatile political environment at this time, especially the UN not being backed up by the important states in a manner that you might wish it would be. How do you deal with that at the moment? And do you see solutions for it?
Yeah, I think we deal with it with great difficulty, is the short answer. They are long-term goals, and they're not, their resolution or their advancement doesn't just need the input of science. In that sense, one could argue that the presentation I just did was a bit simplistic, because the constraints are often political. Let me give you a concrete example. Last year, we faced the threat of famine for the first time in many years in 4 countries: northern Nigeria, Somalia, Yemen, and South Sudan. In many of those countries, the threat of famine was linked to climatic change and environmental factors. But in all cases, in a greater or lesser proportion, the prevalence of conflict and the lack of the possibility to resolve that conflict was the main driver of famine. So famine was no longer just a question of a lack of rainfall or extreme weather events, but was directly related to the failure to achieve peace. And that failure to achieve peace on a local level is more and more influenced by regional and in some cases global political dynamics. So there, you know, I don't want to get into the GMO debate, but no amount of GMOs is gonna solve the problem where the problem is conflict. The Central African Republic, to come back to my favorite example, could be a net food-producing country. It has all the climatic and soil conditions, but it's not, and it's not simply because the activities of multiple armed groups, most of them seeking to kill and maim as a means of terrorizing a population into giving them livestock, goats, anything they have, prevents farming that would make that land fertile. So we do need to overcome these political constraints, which at this time in history where the Security Council is perhaps more divided than it's ever been since the Cold War, is very, very difficult. But I would argue that that's not going to change on its own. I mean, there are powerful member state interests at play. And I think part of it is that also that the voters say what they expect of their member states, that voters in certain countries of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council made clear that they don't just want to see interesting theatrics of their representatives in the Security Council with clever exchanges of insults, but they want to actually see their diplomats doing diplomacy and moving towards consensus on how to resolve international conflict. And I think that sort of popular demand is a little bit lacking, and hence the stage is open for some of this much more polarized politicizing of conflict that we're seeing today.
So the question is really, from the point of view of a global body like the United Nations, or indeed from our point of view, if we want to devote our time to solving these challenges of resources and healthcare, food, nutrition, from a grand perspective in an innovative fashion, what's the best way that we can cooperate with large global bodies like the UN? What sort of approaches are currently in progress?
I think the key is that across communities, the time, and I think technology makes that more and more clear, especially on the digital front. The time where problems could be solved by governments alone, I think have long since passed. I mean, the shift of power relations, if in terms of the newest technological developments, has shifted heavily towards private companies. Self-regulation of private companies is determining more the approach to norms than states. In many cases, they've been left behind. So I think across stakeholder groups, across civil society, industry, government, of course, and academia, we need to come together much better to plot the way forward in a way that maximizes the global good. And there has to be a much better sense of burden sharing. I mean, you started your question by alluding to population movements. I think that's a very good example. I mean, in Europe, part of Europe went into panic at the threat of refugee and migrant flows. If you look at it, I think in 2016, which was one of the years of the largest numbers, there were just over 1 million people on the move towards Europe. 1 million people for a continent of 500 million, frankly, is nothing. It can be very easily handled. I mean, Uganda, a country of a fraction of that population, has hosted well over 1 million South Sudanese refugees without great difficulty, not to speak of Lebanon or Pakistan and many other countries that host very large proportions of their own population in refugees. But in Europe, the burden was left to a handful of countries to bear, while other countries washed their hands. If an effective burden sharing system had been possible, and not only with governments playing their role, but civil society, etc., what turned into a massive political crisis, which is polarizing and frankly paralyzing Europe to this day, could have been handled in a way that would have made Europe reinforced its authority on the global stage instead of undermining it, which is what the case was. So I think building alliances both across stakeholder groups and across borders is the way forward in addressing these global challenges.
Hi. First of all, thank you for the great speech. My name is John. I'm originally from Istanbul, Turkey, and I'm a microbiologist turned consultant. My question would be regarding, first of all, let me start out by saying, you also explicitly said that one of the sustainable development goals for UN is zero hunger.
And hidden hunger is a challenge that we're, of course, trying to address. Biofortification came up within the panel, the previous panel, specifically asking, how is UN trying to address the challenge of hidden hunger within the dimensions of policymaking, access to technology, and social awareness within the developing world?
Yes, well, I mean, we work wherever we are very closely with national authorities and national non-governmental organizations. So they're the principal tools of outreach and diagnosis of where the constraints are. I mean, in terms of hidden hunger, I think there are different facets. What is not broadly known is the majority of extreme poverty is now in middle-income countries, and that's also a factor of inequality. I served, before going to the Central African Republic, in Colombia. Colombia, in many sense, is a highly developed middle-income country, but with massive internal differences. In Bogota, the poverty rate is around 10 or 11% and going down by the day. In Chocó, which is a province on the Pacific coast, the poverty rate is as high as 80% in some regions. So the sort of middle income bracket can hide very real needs, including hunger. In Colombia, in the northeast, on the Venezuelan border, there are still indigenous people dying of malnutrition. So there we work, but in Colombia you have a very open government. You have statistics and you have a government that's willing to address that. And so there is room for the UN to work with national societies. In other countries, the very use of the phrase humanitarian crisis, and there's a country not so far away from Colombia, where we're still not allowed to use that phrase, although the situation is extremely difficult, and I think 90% of the population say they don't have adequate access to food, but the government is in denial, and there it becomes much more difficulty. So again, you're back to politics.
Mr. Secretary, a second question that was following up your answers. Following as well what is happening across the world, especially in one of the security permanent members of the UN, that is denying certain degree of scientific knowledge. So, as scientists, what we could do to get notoriety on the decision-making process of our countries, from them to international agencies, and to be heard and to be taken into account.
I wonder who you're talking about. But no, I think, where there's where scientists come together, especially across boundaries, so nobody can accuse them of promoting a version of events that's linked to a specific political agenda or a political agenda of a certain group of countries. So where you have that international consensus, I think it's tremendously powerful. And even if some governments or some parts of governments or some individual in governments, even in the most powerful states, take a different view, the momentum is there. I mean, I think in the US, even if on the climate accord, the government has backtracked, this administration has undone the commitments made by the previous administration. There's tremendous activism on the part of governors, on the part of mayors, on the part of civil society, on the part of large parts of industry, to keep the climate agenda on track. So I think at this stage, the ability of any single administration in any part of the world to roll back history is difficult. One can slow it down, but to change the course is difficult. And I think where there is scientists speak up across borders, it does have a very powerful effect.
Hi, my name is Quiva and I'm from Dublin, Ireland. So like you were saying, some middle income countries have problem with homelessness and poverty. So in Ireland there's a lot of people either living on the streets or families living out of hotel rooms. And our government obviously is busy with other problems too, but is there anything, do you think, that the people of Ireland can do to try and encourage the government to take homelessness more seriously?
I mean, you know, it's very difficult for me to comment on Irish politics, but I would say, I mean, in Ireland, the people have the power of the vote, and that's a powerful tool. It's also a country with considerable resources, with a very long tradition of strong non-governmental organizations. So I think one that creates an advocacy capacity and an accountability of government that many other countries don't have. So I think that's a good starting point.
My name is Claire Richards. I work for AstraZeneca and have a background in international business, philosophy and politics. I wanted to pick up on something that you said about how it's an ethical question with unintended consequences. So the fact that biotechnology and other technological process could actually lead to further inequality, and that we have to ensure that the scientific revolution leads to constructive social progress rather than just based on business interests. So I'd like to ask the challenges you face in terms of bringing the ethical perspective to the debate and to the table, and how the UN and other stakeholders engage in this debate with businesses to make sure that we are working towards constructive social progress and that those who need it the most are prioritized.
I think in the UN, and most of my colleagues would agree with me, that we don't have enough of that debate. I mean, we talk a lot to our governmental counterparts. We talk a fair amount to non-governmental organizations. Frankly, we don't engage sufficiently, I think, with industry, with business, nor business with us. And I think that has to change. I think there also has to be more mindfulness of the potential for unintended consequences. Let me give you an example, not from the biotech field, but Myanmar, which one of the questions alluded to with the recent outflux of Rohingya, is an interesting case point to see the impact of digital technology on the social fabric. Myanmar did a jump. Most countries jumped from, many countries in Africa never installed landline phone systems. They went straight to the cellular phone and then to the smartphone. Myanmar took it a step further. They didn't really have mobile phones. They went straight from nothing to the smartphone, digitally connected. And there has been an escalation, the worst manifestation of which was the expulsion, deportation, ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya. But there has been, over the past 5 years, a steady increase in social tensions, in hate crimes, in inter-ethnic violence, with the culmination into the massive deportation of the Rohingya. And if you look at it, that period coincided exactly with the rollout of social media and access to the internet in Myanmar. And many have made the point that that's not coincidental. Social media actually facilitated hate crime, actually facilitated inter-ethnic violence. Now, I mean, that frankly is, I'm not sure if that's, there's a lot of speculation at least in that regard. But that everybody with internet, with social media, thought the world would be better connected, there would be greater love and understanding than ever before. And we're realizing more and more that that's not the case. Now, that's not malicious. It's not that the inventors of social media had any intention, quite to the contrary. Their intention was the very opposite. But this has happened, and I think now we need to wake up. We need to acknowledge it, and I think there were, the Facebook's appearance before in the US before Congress was a very good indicator of that. I think there is a little bit of sense of mea culpa, but I think across these industries where progress is happening at such a speed that I don't think we're fully aware, even those who understand the technology, and certainly not those who don't, are fully aware of all the potential consequences. And I think some soul searching is necessary, and a much better dialogue between the UN and the industry, I think, would help in that respect.
Good morning. I'm Amadeus from Indonesia. Thank you for making your time for us. So, first, could you please elaborate more about biological inequality? And the second one, how does the UN evaluate your contribution? For example, like the statistics, the decrease of malnutrition for the last 10 years, for example. Does the UN measure like, okay, the UN might play a role, for example, in 1% of this, something like that? I'm just curious about the evaluation process. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, on the evaluation process, I'm afraid it's a little bit beyond my competency, but I mean, UNICEF, WHO have scientifically accepted methods for tracking these trends based on both figures they receive from government, but that are verified, and their own measurements based on long experience in the field. In terms of biological inequality, I mean, I'm sure there are many in this audience who understand it much better than I. But I was very struck shortly after I came back from the Central African Republic, where stunting is a major problem. I mean, stunting, the thing about stunting is that people survive. It's not like the worst forms of malnutrition, where at the end, sadly, the sufferer dies. I mean, children will grow up. The problem is their development processes are irretrievably harmed as a result of multiple lacking factors, micronutrients, healthcare, perhaps clean water, and while they were under 5 years old. And it has very long-term consequences. It has long-term consequences on their cognitive capacities, on their learning capacities, on their growth capacities, and that's scientifically proven and well known. And that in turn has an impact on the country. And you know, we're not talking about a small marginal group of children. In many countries in Africa, we're talking about 20, 30, 40, 50% of the population. So the impact is absolutely massive. And then, and this is why I drew the example in my speech, I was very struck shortly after I came back from Central African Republic, listening to, just driving and turning on the radio as one does, and hearing a debate on public radio between two groups of people talking about the degree that those who choose to have a baby through artificial insemination, the degree of choice they should have. And there was one group who's saying that it was perfectly legitimate for those who chose that route to say, I want to have I want the potential donor to have been a philosopher, or to have been a biochemist, or to have come from Cambridge. And everybody agreed on that. But there was another group who said, no, we can go a step further. We should also be able to choose the IQ level. So I should be able to say, I want the donor of my father to have an IQ have had an IQ above X. And the first group said, no, that's too much. That's sort of designer babies. But saying a philosopher or a Cambridge graduate is okay, but an IQ above this is okay. Now, think about that. I mean, I don't mean to be derogatory of that. I mean, that's an appropriate debate in our times. But how does that compare when you have, you know, literally on a plane from New York, you have to go through Paris, but you can get there in less than 24 hours. Not so far away in terms of today's travel, you have a population where you know that about half the population have their cognitive capacities are impeded because of lack of food, adequate medical care, and clean water between the ages of 3 and 5. Whereas over here, you're debating about to what extent is it permissive to try and predetermine the IQ level of your offspring. That's what I mean by biological inequality, and that's already happening. That's not some science fiction prediction for the future.
I'm afraid we have to conclude the Q&A session here, but Fabrizio will be around for the refreshments during the day, so you can chat about him then. So let's thank Fabrizio again for a really inspiring speech and a great discussion.
Thank you.